Hello there, and welcome to the Star Wars Guys YouTube channel where the Force is family. I am Mando on Fire, and we're actually going to be doing a review today. So, something that I actually got to do about a week ago is that I actually got to see my first movie since the pandemic. So, one thing that we all missed as a result of COVID is that we've all missed going to movies, thus, who are big, avid movie fans like myself. Now, that being said, I wanted this movie experience to be absolutely perfect. I want to watch the best movie that there was. And today, that brings me to the topic of today. We are going to talk about Venom Let There Be Carnage. Now, this is a movie that I've wanted to watch for a while, just because for all of you Marvel fans, this is a big deal since Carnage and Venom are essentially two complete opposite beings. Now, I will get into heavy detail on some of the plot, and I'll also be looking at some of the numbers of how well it did regarding its budget, its box office, as well as may as well. I'll look at some of the Rotten Tomatoes just to see what the critics thought, just for the record. Now, with that being said, like I said, I am going to go into heavy detail with the plot itself, so consider this to be your spoiler warning. So if you have not seen this movie, I recommend you turn off this video right now and go watch it. And if you have to wait a couple of months until it goes onto Blu-ray or streaming, please do it. Just because I don't want to do the service of spoiling the movie to you. And so with that being said, you have been warned of spoilers. So Venom, Let There Be Carnage. So this is actually a follow-up to the original Venom movie, starring Tom Hardy as both Eddie Brock and Venom. Now, to kind of pick up where we left off, basically we ended the movie Venom with how Venom and Eddie have bonded with each other, and they had to essentially save the Earth from the other symbiote, Riot, who is at the time controlling the CEO of the Life Foundation, and tried to bring symbiotes here. Now, it left us this one little post-credit scene back in the first Venom movie where we see Cletus Cassidy being played by Woody Harrelson, which, by the way, does an amazing job in portraying Cletus as himself. And so, well, he leaves off with this, where he goes to the San Quentin prison, and all Cassidy does was leave this one quote: "When I get out, and I will, there's going to be carnage," which is clearly a foreshadowing of this movie that we're going to talk about here. Now, enough of the context, let's actually get into the story. So the movie picks up in a scene where there's these two individuals, where one of them is by the name of Shriek, and the other one is, of course, Cletus Cassidy, who will eventually become Carnage, who was at the San Estes School for Unwanted Children, basically an insane asylum for lack of a better term. And they are transferring Shriek into a secure facility, which in this case is going to be Ravenclaw, the Ravencroft Institute. Now, during that flashback, however, Shriek tries to escape, and Peter Mulligan, the detective at the time, shoots her in the eye. And remember Peter Mulligan, since I will actually be talking about him a little bit later. And then eventually, Shriek is then taken to Ravencroft. And another thing to keep in mind as well is that Cletus and Shriek are kind of having a sort of romantic relationship with each other. Now we flash back into how present day is, where now we see Peter Mulligan giving Eddie permission to interview Cletus Cassidy, but this is actually because Cletus has hidden several bodies everywhere because he is unfortunately a serial killer. Now, eventually both Venom and Eddie work together to actually find the bodies and then place Cletus into death row just because there was evidence to convict him to the death penalty. Now, I want to take a little side tangent and make myself clear when it comes to Venom and Eddie's relationship. Even though that they had bonded in the first movie, and they are what is considered symbiotic, where they're pretty much working together and they're a perfect match, almost like an organ donor, where let's say I have to take my liver out and donate it to somebody, I cannot just give it to anybody I want. It has to be an exact match, so to speak. But even with that being said, Venom and Eddie somewhat don't see eye to eye so far as how they should view the world, whereas Venom just wants to go out, well, save the world, and eat bad guys, as he says. Whereas Eddie doesn't really feel like he can, just because he knows that the Life Foundation was after him, and that the FBI knows what happened at the Life Foundation. So if he were to go out of his way and do something like save the world and eat bad guys, they would be goners. Now, this brings us to this one scene where we get to see a little bit more of Cletus's his personality and basically who he is and why he is the way he is. Where in the comics it is said that he was sort of not sane, even as a child, let's just say, where he did a few things that are certainly heinous things, where he describes how he pushed down his grandmother down the stairs through a hairdryer in his mom's shower, and then I forget what he did with his dad, but obviously no bueno there. And then as a result, he gets sent to St. Estes, where he then meets Shriek. And this was when they were young kids, and so they almost had a puppy love with each other. And so, well, that's kind of how their relationship somewhat kindled, if you will. And so, well, that makes Cletus think as soon as he sees Eddie while he's in death row, he tries to make Eddie seem like he's basically just like Cletus, where wherever he goes, he just ruins everything, like no matter what. And he also gets to see a little bit about Eddie's personality and why he is the way he is, where it turns out that his mother actually died of childbirth, and his father, Eddie's father that is, actually he disowned him because of that. It was rather abusive. Now, well, Cletus tries to turn this around and make it think that Eddie was the one responsible for it. And of course, this angers Eddie, and then the two of them get into an altercation where then Cletus bites Eddie's hand. Now, as the guard is taking away Eddie, he notices something strange. The blood is like sentient, it's almost moving, and he says, "I've tasted blood before, and that's not it." And he knows that there's something different about Eddie's blood, and so he tastes it and ingests it. And then this is kind of where we get to sort of the pinnacle of Venom and Eddie's sort of dysfunctional relationship, where they have this altercation where Venom is thinking, "Oh, you're so lucky that I chose you. Look at what I can make you do." And then Eddie's enraged on how he acted during the jailbreak. Well, not the jailbreak, but while Cletus was in death row. He basically says, "Well, you're not so great. You got kicked off of your own planet. You said it yourself. You're a loser." And then the two of them get into a fight, and eventually Venom separates with Eddie. Seemingly, he just wanted to do his own thing, and that's pretty much it. And just before then, they actually go to dinner with Anne Wang, which was Eddie's ex-girlfriend, an ex-fiance, I should say, who just announced that she's getting married. Now, Venom, on one hand, is actually not happy with this. He wants Eddie and Anne to get married and basically have a family with each other. But Eddie, being the kind of guy he is sad about Anne not being married to him, is still willing to accept this, but it still can create some sort of a confusion, almost a confliction of two feelings. Now, this is where things get good, where I'm actually going to show you essentially what happens. I'm going to be pulling up some pictures just to show you what happens. So we finally get to see Cletus in the injection chamber, where he says, "Enjoy the show," as his supposed last words. And then as the warden injects the serum into him, he actually finds that there's something inside of Eddie, well, Cletus, I mean, that's pushing him out of the serum. Like the serum is being pushed out of Cletus's body. And so, with that being said, we actually get our first look of Cletus Cassidy fully transformed as Carnage. And it is brutal. Where I'm going to go ahead and just pull up this and go ahead and screen share it so that you can basically see what I am seeing here. And so right here is actually a picture of transformed Cletus Cassidy into Carnage. And so, well, with that being said, you're at here. Let me go ahead and see if I can get it bigger. There it is. So, well, this is Cletus Cassidy fully transformed into Carnage, where he makes no effort to break out, basically, because it's just so flawless. Where he's fighting all of the guards and even letting some of the prisoners out just to create a prisoner riot. And I want to show you this just because you can see that he is just an unstoppable force to be reckoned with. Alright, so now moving on, where we are actually going to talk a little bit more about the plot, and then after that we'll just kind of move towards the numbers and how it did, and then also give a little bit of news on how well this performed when this came out. And so, after Venom and Eddie had their own divorce, if you will. Well, Venom is pretty much going from person to person trying to actually have fun. And he eventually goes to this party where he thinks it's all for him. And he says, "Thank you so much for being here. Eddie was wrong. I'm living the best life thus far." But then he kind of realizes that Eddie's not there. And then he eventually kind of comes to his senses that he's alone. And so is Eddie. He comes to his senses alone. Now, jumping back to the character Peter Mulligan, where we first see him shoot Shriek in the eye. Now, he actually is getting a little bit suspicious of things going on, where he recalls the Life Foundation incident and then recalls things going weird because of Eddie being involved with Cletus Cassidy. And then it is later revealed that Peter Mulligan was the one who shot Shriek, and as a result had to get a little hearing aid because one of Shriek's main powers is that she can give a sonic wave of sound. Like, it's a little bit harder to explain, but she can shout really loudly, almost like Black Canary. And then eventually Shriek and Cletus actually meet up with each other, and he breaks her out of Ravenclaw Croft, where they plan to get married. Now, I do want to make this thing. There is a character in Marvel Comics known as Shriek, but she actually is a symbiote. But in this version, and Shriek is more or less just a Black Canary clone. That's all there really is. Which I gotta to admit, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to see the Shriek symbiote, but I'm kind of glad with what we got. And then you can also kind of see some of Carnage's intentions too, where basically Cletus and Carnage are not necessarily working together, but they have their own little vendettas, you can say, where Carnage wants to kill Venom, and then all Cletus wants to do is marry Shriek. And then you gotta see that they're not exactly together. They're not like working together just as well as Venom and Eddie. Just because when Shriek had blown up one of the helicopters with her voice, it makes Carnage kind of freak out in a sense, where Carnage somewhat separates from Cletus and says to Cletus, if she does that again, I'm going to bite her face off. Because one key thing is that it's a sound with high frequencies, and fire are the two main weaknesses of symbiotes. And Shriek just so happens to be one of those weaknesses. Now, eventually, just to cut things a little bit, just to basically jump to the next few parts, eventually, Anne finds Venom inside of somebody, brings them back to Eddie, and then they kind of have a more or less sort of makeshift little sorry apologizing session where her, Eddie does genuinely apologize, but he's more or less rushed to fight Cletus, Cassidy, and Carnage, where they actually then meet up Cletus with Shriek at a church, and this is more specifically the chapel hall over there, and they had actually he hijacked it and got the church father to pray over to officiate the ceremony. They managed to get Pete Mulligan there, and then Anne as well, because all that Shriek really wanted was revenge on the cop that shot her eye, and then Cletus and Carnage, on the other hand, wanted revenge on Eddie and Venom by killing Anne. And so, one thing to keep in mind is that even though Venom is a pretty strong being in of his own right, he's scared of Carnage, where he looks at Eddie and says, "This is worse than I thought. That is a red one," and he's not ready to fight him. And then, with that being said, we actually get into one of the best fights ever, between Venom and Carnage, where clearly Carnage is at the advantage, where he uses tendrils coming from his back and basically manipulates them in any way, shape, or form, where he can turn them into projectiles, blades, or just whatever he can and think of, or just whatever he can get his mind on. And so, Venom just has to make do with what he has, which is pretty much just himself. And then we actually get a little bit of a chat between Cletus and Eddie as the bell is ringing in the background, where Carnage and Venom are sort of going in and out of their own hosts, where in between those bell tolls, Cletus basically says, here's what I'm doing. You know that paper that you wrote about me?" Of course, referencing to the bodies that were found when he was at San Quentin prison. "You only told one half the story," is what Cletus says. "You didn't tell that everyone in my life was abusive. How my father, my grandmother, and my mother were all abusive to me. And that I only did this for revenge. And so with that being said, I am not crazy. I'm not a crazy man, but I am a vengeful one," is what he says. Now, this actually leads into literally the best shot of the film. Something that we have been waiting for ever since this movie came out. It all starts with just one simple quote. "There be carnage. Let there be carnage," is what he says. This is the ultimate part of the movie, where Carnage just takes up and weighing it, and he establishes himself as dominant. Like, he's nearly beaten Venom at this point. And I do want to mention this as a side tangent. That purpose of the clip was meant for reviewing purposes and reaction purposes. So, copyright stuff, I do not want to get involved with that. Now, one thing that I want to keep in mind is that I mentioned earlier that Cletus and Carnage are not necessarily symbiotic like Venom and Eddie are. But with that being said, he actually he's actually exposed and thought not to be symbiotic. And so, well, what happens here is that Shriek eventually comes to her senses and thinks, okay, this isn't right, I need to do something. And eventually she is taken and falling downwards, and then uses her voice to make the bell toll, and eventually it separates Cletus and Carnage, where then Carnage is eaten by Venom, and so is Cletus. And to be honest, I really don't know how I feel about this scene, because in the comics, it's actually not that easy to separate Carnage from Cletus, because the reason being is that in the comics, he is actually bonded with Cletus through his blood. Now, this is what makes Carnage red, where originally Carnage was black. But in this case, Carnage is red because of Cletus's blood, thus making it almost near impossible to unbind with him. And they really don't go into a whole lot of detail with this part of the movie, but I digress. So, with that being said, we pretty much go to the end of the movie where they actually have a lot of thought provoking themes about this, where they go to a statue with Don Quixote and I forget the other guy's name, but Don Quixote and the squire, where Eddie basically says, these are these two guys. They basically had two totally different views of the world. But despite how different their worldviews are, they could never really be separated from each other, which tells us, the audience, that Venom and Eddie are just like Don Quixote and his squire. They're inseparable, even though they're very much different. And that pretty much concludes the main plot of the story. Now, of course, we do get ourselves a post-credit scene for Venom, and I actually wanted to talk about that because it actually is pretty interesting if we were to consider the following. So, I want to show you this. I do want to apologize for the quality of what you're about to see, just because it's honestly not even that great. But once you see it, it'll pretty much tell you everything that you need to know. And here it is. So, actually, this is the wrong screen, but we can actually talk about this right now. So, this is actually our budget for Venom Let There Be Carnage. So, estimated budget was roughly about $110 million. Whereas, if we look over here, where Black Widow is looking at $200 million, the Eternals is $200 million, Venom $100 million, and the Batman $100 million. And then, of course, you can see our sites here: Wikipedia, Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and IMDb. And then, with that being said, here is the box office of Venom worldwide. So I'll go ahead and pull that up, and you'll actually see that it's rather interesting, to say the least. Where right here, we actually get this. So this is a little tidbit from FilminoFan.com, where it says Venom 2 broke records in the U.S. market as well. The movie opened with $90 million figures in the domestic box office. So basically, just in the just in the U.S., it made $90 million in the box office. And so I'll go ahead and pull up the rest of the article, which was posted in the 23rd of October in 2021. And then it says that roughly over here is that the worldwide the budget is that the worldwide the box office collection of Venom Let There Be Carnage was actually at 300 it was actually at $397 million worldwide. And then and so basically it made about 3 times its budget, which is, I would say, in my personal opinion, good. And then of course it says here that it made it 287 million, but I digress on that. And then we're actually going to go into a little bit of news on when it actually first opened. So I'll go ahead and pull that up. And this is actually from a source called complex.com, where it says, quote, Venom Let There Be Carnage grosses $90 million, scores biggest opening weekend of a pandemic era. So Venom Let There Be Carnage has the biggest score, her biggest opening weekend box office since the 2019. Deadline reports Tom Hardy starring film grossed $90 million this week, and this is referring to the week during the date October 3rd of 2021. And this is in the exceeding Black Widow's previous record of $80.8 million to earn the highest domestic opening since the pandemic. Globally, the Marvel sequel took in an additional $13.8 million, which brings in its box office total to a sizable $103.9 million. So it nearly makes its budget within the first opening weekend alone. And so here's a quote here where it says, For us, Venom Let There Be Carnage absolutely validates our exclusive theatrical window strategy, says Sony president Joshua Greenstein in a statement per Deadline. If you look at the history of theatrical, the obituaries have been written many times and they've been proven wrong. We had confidence in the theatrical experience, confidence in our big valuable IP, and took full advantage and had the patience to weather all of this. The strategy is paying off, and we are happy about it. It's nice validation using the theatrical strategy. Continuing on. Before Venom's impressive weekend, the top pandemic era debuts were Black Widow at $80 million, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, $75 million, and then Fast and Furious 9, $70 million. The film's director, Andy Serkis, teased the probability of making an eventual MCU crossover. That's the question on everybody's lips, Serkis said earlier this month. They want to know when Venom is going to meet Spider-Man. Personally, it's never going to happen. I'm only joking. Of course it's going to happen, he says. I think there's so much. It depends on when you want to get there and what the appetite is. If more people want to see Venom, if people want to see more Venom stories, then we jump straight to Spider-Man. You could be missing on so many great super villain characters between now and then. So it definitely speaks volume that they did their homework, especially around this area over here where they were so adamant about pushing Venom Let There Be Carnage to be only released in theaters, since back in the day, since pandemic and nobody really wanted to go outside of their homes for a while, they released new movies on various streaming services, including Disney Plus, but of course not limiting to Disney Plus. All right, so continuing, and that is pretty much it so far as that article goes. It definitely shows how Venom Let There Be Carnage really was a big deal movie. Now, another thing I do want to say is that when they actually first showed the movie to fans, like before it even released back in England, they made it explicitly clear, hey, do not spoil this. But of course, you know how fans are. They all spoiled it. But of course, I didn't get any spoilers, so I'm glad with that. Now, kind of going back to what that article said about a possible MCU crossover. this is where things get interesting, which actually leads me to this photo here, where I was going to show you, but slight change of plans. I was going to show you this post-credit scene image of Venom. So in this photo, it actually sees Venom seeing on the dailybugle.net TV show where it sees Tom Holland Spider-Man unmasked, and Venom is slightly intrigued. Now, before this actually happened, and before we actually get this scene, we actually get into we actually get into the idea of a bigger universe, even without the MCU crossover, where Venom and Eddie were talking about, oh, why did you keep this a secret? Why didn't you tell me that Carnage was literally your son? And then and then Venom says that 80 million light years of symbiote knowledge is too much for you, which then kind of teases into a much larger universe by just saying that line. Now, just before Venom is able to share his information, we see things shift where Eddie and Venom were in like this little hut somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly they look like they're in a five-star hotel, and the TV turns on saying that Spider-Man has been unmasked. So you heard that right. Venom is now in the MCU. And of course, this is only because Marvel, Disney, and Sony are actually teaming up with each other since they had their little disputes, which is good for us fans because all we really wanted was to see another Spider-Man versus Venom that is actually good. Now, with that being said, that pretty much concludes everything I have to talk about regarding the actual movie. Now, here are some of my thoughts on it. So, I managed to watch this in the theaters, and it was a little bit overwhelming, especially with some of the loud sounds in the theater, but of course, to be expected. Now, there are some things that you should know about this movie where there are some things that may offend you about this movie, such as how church is depicted. Now, it doesn't make it explicitly clear, but it's one of those things that you have to watch out for. Now, I'm not saying this to warn you and say, hey, don't watch this movie. It has this, that, and the other in it. I'm only saying it just because there are going to be those people who are offended by whatever they see on screen, whether it is intentional or not. And of course, if you are offended by it, you have that right to, and you have your right to your own opinion. And so with that being said, I want to get into some more thoughts on it. I do think that the look of Carnage really is accurate because I think Carnage in of itself is something that is really difficult to pull off on the big screen. But of course, Andy Serkis and the people in Columbia Pictures did an amazing job at it. And I do kind of wish that they had expanded upon this Venom and Eddie sort of dilemma, or debacle, I should say, because excuse me, just because it would be nicer to see their whole relationship kind of twist and turn throughout the entire film. And with that being said, I also somewhat wish that Carnage and Cletus didn't get eaten just because of the comic parallels where in the comics the two of them were really symbiotic, and that Carnage actually bonded with Cletus's blood, and basically just make it a little bit more comic accurate. But you know what? Sometimes comic accuracy can be dismissed in some movies, but that's just how I feel about this movie. Just because I do think that Carnage in of himself should be a returning villain. And then I also want to get into the possible future of Venom Let There Be Carnage, because as it turns out, Peter Mulligan was in the comics. And so I'll go ahead and show you just how more significant Peter Mulligan is. As it turns out, he is part of the symbiote verse as well. And he's actually known as Toxin when he takes up a symbiote form. And yes, Toxin as a symbiote. And so here's a few images where I'm going to go with this one right here. So this here is Toxin, aka Patrick Mulligan. In fact, maybe I just said it wrong. Maybe it's Peter Mulligan or Patrick Mulligan. But I digress. But they actually teased this in the movie where possibly Mulligan is going to become Toxin, because in one of the closing scenes of Venom, Let There Be Carnage, is that we see Detective Mulligan lay on the floor, and his eyes go from like brown to like white, as if something is inside of him. So I think that we're actually going to get a Toxin tease, or a possibly new villain in our hands. Now, just in case some of you don't know who Toxin is, let me break it down for you. So it all starts with Venom giving birth to Carnage the symbiote. And Carnage actually does give birth to a symbiote of his own. This one is Toxin. And it's said that Toxin was actually more powerful than Carnage, and that actually had Carnage somewhat worried. Now, I'm only bringing this up just because this is the way it is in comics, and it could be a little bit different in the movie itself. So I do think that if they bring in this new character, Toxin, and now that they've basically resolved the arc of Eddie and Venom basically getting along now, I can see that they could use Toxin as sort of like a catalyst for saying, hey, we get what you're saying. You and Toxin aren't, you, Detective Mulligan, and Toxin don't get along so well. I know how you feel. And then some altercation may happen, but all of this is purely just speculation of what could happen based on the events of a movie that already happened. And so with that being said, we are now going to close this out. As you have seen that my screen is gone and that you can no longer see my face, but that is okay. So I want to thank you all for watching this very long review, a very spoiler heavy review, and make sure to hit like and subscribe, and also follow our Instagram, and I will put that in the description of this video. And until then, just remember that the Force is family. Thank you.